Sound. Hello everyone and welcome to a very special 11s. This is 11s on the 11th, which I didn't think of as special until we said the date. So welcome. It's good to see you all. We're very happy to have this particular panel on a day when we're going to be kicking off a whole lot of gaming. After this particular panel, at 2 p.m. Central Time today, Pat Rothfuss's channel will be hosting B. Dave Walters and a few other great casts doing a D&D game. And then tonight on this channel, we have a demo game of Blades in the Dark, hosted by Valerie Valdez. So that's going to be exciting. And tomorrow we have a whole day of D&D starting at noon Central Time. But right now, we're doing a panel on inclusive and accessible world building in different media. And I'm going to do a quick rundown of our wonderful panelists. Martha Wells has been a science fiction and fantasy writer since her first fantasy novel was published in 1993. She has won many awards, including a Nebula, 2 Hugos, 2 Locus Awards, and her work has appeared in the Philip K. Dick Award ballot, the BSFA Award ballot, the USA Today bestseller list, and the New York Times bestseller list. She is most recently known for her beloved Murderbot series, of which I'm wearing my fan shirt. It's a Sanctuary Moon shirt, which you can get on the Worldbuilders Market website. And I very much appreciate her willingness to let us create this with artwork by Nate Taylor. Casey Lucas Quaid is an award-winning author, graphic novel editor, and video game developer. She's the recipient of the 2020 Sir Julius Vogel Award for Best Short Story, along with some bestseller lists and other nominations. She is also the voice talent on the LGBT horror podcast Monsters Out of the Closet and works with Dinosaur Polo Club, contributing to Mini Metro and Mini Motorways. Jen Lyons lives in Atlanta, Georgia with her husband, 3 cats, and a nearly infinite number of opinions. Formerly a video game producer, she now writes full-time and traces her geek roots back to playing first edition Dungeons & Dragons, represent in grade school, and reading her way from A to Z in the school's library. Her 5-book debut epic fantasy series, A Chorus of Dragons, is being published by Tor Books, with a third in the series, The Memory of Souls, released last August in 2020. He's one of those lucky authors to have a book released during the pandemic. S.B. Divya is an author of things like Machine Hood, Runtime, Contingency Plans for the Apocalypse, as well as the co-editor of Escape Pod, a weekly science fiction podcast zine. She is a lover of science, math, fiction, and, along with me, the Oxford comma. She enjoys subverting expectations and breaking stereotypes whenever she can. Mike Selinker is a game designer. Did I pronounce that right, Mike?
Yes, you pronounced game designer correctly.
Okay, good. Puzzle maker and president of Lone Shark Games, a company which he founded. His design credits include Pirates of the Spanish Main and Fightball with James Ernest, Axis and Allies Revised Edition with Larry Harris, the Marvel Superheroes Adventure Game, Risk Godstorm, things in D&D Pathfinder, and a long list of others that I'm not going to read right now. In 2005, Selinker, and James Ernest created Titanic Games with Paizo Publishing to add a board game arm to Paizo's RPG House. And then our moderator, Jennifer Kretschmer, I want to give a special shout out for her agreeing to do this on short notice, is a producer, writer, and performer with nearly 20 years of tabletop gaming experience as a player and DM, and she also writes, consults, speaks, and streams on tabletop content and RPGs. You can catch her, among other places, weekly on D&D Beyond's live stream tabletop show, Silver and Steel. She has worked in front of or behind the camera on more than 1,000 episodes of television, and is an ambulatory wheelchair user with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and is the creator of the Accessibility in Gaming Resources Guide, which you will have linked to in the chat. She is a passionate advocate for disabled accessibility, inclusion, and representation in media. And on that note, and before I turn this over to you, I want to acknowledge the fact that there is a problem with this panel, which is that it is a panel talking about inclusivity that is overwhelmingly white. And that is a failure on my part, for which I will do better in future panels. and is not a reflection at all on any of the panelists. So I want to acknowledge that and say that we will do better in the future. So with that, Jennifer, please take it away.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Ray. And thank you everybody for being here to support World Builders. This is an amazing cause and such an important one. And I'm really grateful for everyone who is here and donating. And please, it's been an amazing event so far. Please keep those donations coming in. Even small amounts are so incredibly helpful. And there's so much cool swag. Follow the links and come join this party. So I wanted to start out talking to everyone about what defines accessibility and inclusion for you in world building, in media, in products. So what are the things that make something accessible? What makes something inclusive?
Gonna mute myself really quick. Sorry, there's an airplane passing overhead and I don't live near an airport, so this is really loud and really odd. So someone else take it away.
And also I wanted to note that I want to invite anyone on the panel who is disabled. If you would like to disclose, please feel free. And if not, there is never any pressure or reason that anyone should ever have to disclose if they do not choose to.
Well, I will dive in and say that I am not disabled. I have been legally blind before the definition there changed, but with correctable vision. So I now have cyborg eyes, which is really cool. I have implanted contact lenses. And that has been life-changing in good ways. But in terms of inclusion and accessibility, I think for me, the most important thing is representation in ways that are accurate and fair and wide-ranging, I think is really what it is. And that is both in terms of representation across different identity axes, but also within those. I'm gonna steal a term that I think, I'm sorry, I can't remember who came up with this, but the Highlander effect of, there is one, oh, thank you. Yeah, so there's one character, who ends up being either a token or a catch-all and therefore bears way too much weight and cannot get into nuance and things like that. So to me, yeah, I think it's really ultimately about being able to have a good variety of representation on multiple dimensions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I have a history, I think, of throwing, you have to sort of start out with tokenism in some sense because your first character is always going to be the first character, right? But you have a responsibility to follow that up pretty quickly. When we introduced Black characters into Betrayal at House on the Hill, people were like, why are there so many different looking characters? But when we had them in later games, nobody blinked an eye. When we introduced our first trans character, or first gay character, or first trans character into Pathfinder, we got all sorts of posts. But by the time we had the third or fourth or fifth, there was less pressure with the first, and so, yeah, I think it's about not just sort of making sure that you get a single character out there, but also that you're committed to always having people be able to see themselves in my case, your games. We also have the expectation that we have to design for people who aren't us, and that isn't just on the level of what you can see in the game, but how you function in the game. So we very early in the Marvel Superheroes Adventure games started dealing with color blindness as a major issue, trying to make sure that a game that was all about playing cards in color was going to be playable for everybody in all levels of the color blindness spectrum. We have audio versions of a lot of our stuff to make sure that people who are blind can still play. I mean, we just make sure over and over again that we give a place for people who can see themselves and function the way they need to function. And I don't know any other way to do that now that we've been doing it for this long, because the criticism comes from a fair number of people, but it just fades away and the praise lasts forever.
Yeah. I think especially books and stories are just kind of an ideal place to talk about invisible disabilities, which I know a lot of people, it's a problem for me. I have rheumatoid arthritis, but it's under control with medication. I have some social anxiety and other anxiety related problems. And just being able to talk about your own experience in your fiction is really freeing. And I think it does help you connect with readers. It makes a lot of readers feel seen. So it's kind of an ideal place for it. And I think also with regard to what you were talking about, Mike, it's so important to be open to what are new to you ideas and criticisms, and you realize, well, here's a really simple thing we could do. We should have been doing it, but we just didn't know about it. Mm-hmm. And just be open to that all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of extrapolating a little bit on what both Mike and Martha said. So I have a condition which is like the ultimate invisible disability. It is a condition called palindromic rheumatism, which is basically rheumatoid arthritis that doesn't show up on x-rays. So try getting a doctor to believe you have that. Yeah, super cool. Yeah. But so that is something that I've definitely explored a lot of in my fiction, because one of the things you can do with fiction with this ability to change points of view and introduce simile and metaphor is you can show people what it's like to feel the feelings you feel when you come up against those ableist barriers in the world, without specifically having to sit them down and be like, now, okay, this story is what it's like to be a disabled 12-year-old girl growing up in this place. And it's just very, it's almost like a little like brain hack empathy shortcut. You can just be like, hey, people, this is what it feels like to be a person going through these experiences. And you don't even have to state it so literally if you aren't comfortable with disclosing, or if for, length or medium related reasons, you don't feel like going into it. And regarding what Mike said, one of the things that I see as like a true pillar of inclusivity is not just being able and being willing to include characters with differences, with disabilities, characters from varied backgrounds, characters of varied races and genders, but being willing to openly and passionately defend them once you do include them. Because like one of the problems with the whole tokenism issue is that like oftentimes people will be like, well, hey, we made this character. He's in the thing, but like, are you doing anything to defend this character? Are you doing anything to defend the people that you have asked to write or animate or voice act for this character when they are having to deal with backlash from people, be it online or existing fan bases or people being jerks at cons? Like the list of like, I was going to say the list of microaggressions, but let's be real, they're just aggressions, is astounding. And it's really disappointing to see coworkers, I shouldn't say coworkers, but people that I have worked with in the past take that first step towards inclusivity and then just be like, cool, I'm done. And you're not done. That's the first step.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So, I mean, I too have invisible medical treated issues. Thank goodness for modern medicine. So I do not have to be permanently sidelined. I have Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid condition, and I have Facet syndrome, which is a rheumatoid arthritis condition of the lower spine that would probably have put me sort of permanently out of commission if not for wonderful drugs. So, when I sat down to write my books, I knew what I didn't want. And what I didn't want was a fantasy setting that looked like Europe. It made it really easy. Just, I didn't want it to look like Europe. And the idea that what everyone else has said, the idea that if you have more representation, if you have more representation of all of this, then it gives you so much more ability, like it gives you so much more freedom. So it's very perplexing to me why people don't seem to want to embrace that, because it's really liberating. Just creatively, it's how I absolutely would want to do things by preference. So
yeah, it can be a design challenge too for us, right? I mean, like when we made the game The Ninth World, it's set 1 billion years in the future, and so there are no gender pronouns in the game. There are no characters that have white skin. There are no characters that have what I would say is the furthest darkest black skin either, right? I mean, there's just a lot of, it's not a mishmash. It's the senses that when you're writing in an environment like that, it's different 1 billion years from now, and so it should feel like something that we expect to change, and it still doesn't deal with the stuff. And sometimes for me it's like I want to confront things that scare me. So when we made Apocrypha, I made a game about Alzheimer's disease, and I've seen it do some things in my family, and I was like, okay, this thing is a challenge. How can I write a game that's still fun and enjoyable but still deals with the thing that makes people scared? And so a lot of people, since they heard that, have come to me and said, I'm dealing with cognitive issues too, and playing your game actually helps. That tells me that I'm never going to get the sense, I hope I'm not going to get the sense that I know what it's like to have certain characteristics that some of my characters or some of the elements of my game have, but it's important for me to do the research. It's important for me to do it right, because people are going to show up who have those elements of their lives reflected in the game. They don't want to see it as false. Like, it's an actual serious decision to be inclusive, because it creates significantly more pressure on you to be right, which I think is actually quite helpful.
Well, and going back to a little bit to what Casey said, moderated spaces for discussion and everything are so important. And I still see people in this day and age being really naive about how, a space for people to discuss these things is going to be attacked. Like years ago, I was working on with a group. We were a few of us were discussing trying to do like a database as a resource for people doing book recommendations and stuff, of books that had people of color as main characters, kind of for teachers, for anybody who was doing book recommendations. And this was like, oh God, probably 20 years ago. And before we could kind of even discuss what the structure was going to be or how we were going to implement it or anything, somebody made a wiki and threw it out there and said, okay, now you're done. Here's this wiki. And it's like, we need to talk about, it has to be moderated. She had it so anybody could, and we couldn't change it. She had it so anybody could edit it. It's like, that's impossible when you're dealing with anything, any kind of marginalized identity or disability or anything like that, because people will come and attack it and do terrible things to it just because they can. And it's like, it has to be moderated. Somebody has to be in charge of it, and somebody has to be in charge of making sure moderators are checking it. And it has to be, there's all these things you have to do. And so it's like, it's still just very frustrating to me. I used to work in websites and some data management and things like that, how naive people can be about the fact that we need moderation. Sites are not going to moderate themselves. If you even have a tiny little guest book or something, it needs to be moderated because somebody's going to find it and do awful things to it.
So can I expand on that for a second and say whose responsibility is the moderation? Because I know that there's so much weight put onto marginalized communities to advocate for ourselves and defend against that full time and educate full time, where are those lines, and who should be responsible for finding that moderation and maintaining it?
Well, for me, when I create something that goes online that is open to the public, I'm responsible for it. I don't have any space that I'm responsible for that I don't control absolutely, basically, and that I won't. I see people talking about, well, I'm trying to, this person came in and he's harassing everybody on my Facebook feed, and I'm trying to think, should I ban him, or should I say something to him? And it's like, I used to have a 3 strikes rule, and now I have a 1 strike rule, because nobody for that. And so if it's, to me, it's the person who created the space and who technically owns the space, and it's their responsibility to moderate. And if you don't want to do that, then don't create the space, basically.
In case you had something to say.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, that's right on it. Basically, so with my I have a few jobs, but my primary job that I spend the most time on, that I am most passionately dedicated to, is that I am a community manager in the video game industry. And yeah, Jen's face says it all. So fortunately,
Mythic Quest.
Yeah, no, it's literally exactly that. Like, they just they keep me in a corner with a lot of houseplants, and they deposit sugar at my desk, and they check to see if I'm okay, and that's pretty much how it goes. But I genuinely believe that at this point, the way that the internet works and the way that internet adjacent spaces work, if you are in a position where it is financially viable for you, or viable in a time sense, if you are putting something out there into the world that people are interacting with, it's not just a who should. I think it's absolutely a duty of care thing. It is your responsibility to moderate these spaces. It is your responsibility to protect your community members and to protect your staff, and treating any sort of community moderation or community management like we'll deal with it when the first big horrible thing happens is terrible mismanagement. And it sets a bad precedent, because it sets a precedent that you don't give a shit until something bad happens. And that's just not a viable strategy. There are just so many different ways that people can interact with your thing and with everyone else's things, and so many different ways that they can call down thousands of people to suddenly be interacting with your thing, whether it's like, congratulations, you made a cool thing and it's gone viral and you now have thousands of new fans, or like, what if someone who has a giant racist hate following decides they don't like you? Like, there are, there's a good side and a bad side to that. And if you are going to be putting things out there on the internet, moderation strategies need to be a very early step of your whole thought process of how you are going to be defining your internet presence and defining the way that you protect the people who love your things. Like, it's the good thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. It's the best business strategy. There's no reason not to do it, provided, again, that you can afford to do so, and that it won't severely drain your resources or your time or cause you any harm to do so. If you're in a position to do so, it is absolutely your responsibility, and you're shooting your own self in the foot if you don't do it, because you can definitely tell when a community is being well moderated and well looked after, and when a community has been designed from the ground up to be welcoming and inclusive, because those are the communities where people stick around for years. Those are the communities that will thrive, that people will look back on fondly. Like, I mean, we've all, like, just think back for a moment, everyone in chat, everyone on the panel, we all have a fond memory of a place that was, be it a writers group or an internet forum or some sort of community that we were in at some point, where we were just like, damn, this is really cool. I feel really safe, and really, like, everyone here is super easy to talk to. And the goal is to just make your community make your community the one that people will look back on 20 years from now and say, like, oh, I had some of the coolest discussions of my life there, and I never had to worry about thing.
I think
Also,
I want to. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I wanted to add that, we've, in addition to moderation, which is super important for making the space feel safe and welcoming, I think there's an additional step, especially that's been more clear today than it was maybe 20 years ago when the internet was a little bit younger. And that is to invite people from underrepresented communities into that space. It's great to make it safe and welcoming and, a comfortable place for the people who naturally gravitate there. But there are a lot of people who self-exclude just on the assumption of past experiences, of attitudes they've had to deal with. They don't necessarily know or trust that these places are going to be safe and welcoming. Or they just don't want the additional burden of being the only representative, again, of whatever that particular axis is, right? So I think the especially as content creators or curators, even more than creators, like this is a thing we try to do at Escape Pod, is bring people in and explicitly go out and invite them to come in and participate. And I think that can also make a huge difference, both in terms of the diversity and representation that you have, but also just giving that feeling of inclusivity and demonstrating accessibility to a variety of people.
Yeah, I think in our case, I'm here because I'm, the most well-known person at my company probably, but if my company all looked like me, we wouldn't make the things that we do. Right? I mean, like you have to start from the principle that if you want to reflect different experiences, you need people who deal with the world in different ways and have had different challenges than you, as you've dealt with them. It doesn't matter who you are. You can't, if you're only going to represent one culture or only represent one experience, you can probably do it by yourself. But if you need to be inclusive and accessible, you should make sure that people on your team are that as well, right? Or from those environments as well. And so, I mean, it was a very aggressive thing when we first founded the company that, we knew what kind of games we wanted to make. And so if we just had, a bunch of white guys making it, it would have produced very different results. And so, we hired to make sure that the people who were making the games could relate to the games that they were making. I think that's, you can try to fake it, but it's going to be more difficult.
Two things. One, just comment on that. Yeah, I completely agree. And I would even also go so far as to say, at least anecdotally, the most successful teams I've ever worked on in terms of video games were very, very diverse. The most creative, efficient, just wonderful teams. And conversely, the least were the most homogenous. So take away from that what you will. But I would also say, as far as the idea of controlling your spaces, that I do think it's actually really important, not just to take that responsibility, but to understand how important it is to maintain that control. Because I've known a number of people in a number of situations over the years where people didn't have that control in the first place, because it was a fan created site, or it was something where they didn't have any control over it, or had given up that control. And it's very awkward, and it often has some very problematic outcomes. So if you can keep control over that kind of space, I think it is a good idea to do that.
One other thing, for inviting people in, basically, there's a convention in Austin, Armadillo-Con, and it has a one-day writing workshop that is part of the convention. You can go to it separately, but you have to pay for it. It includes convention membership. And one of the things they've been doing, there's usually like 40 to 50 students, And then you divide into groups of 5, and there's 2 professional instructors, professional writers or editors for each group. One of the things they've been doing is reserving 10 to 12 seats for writers of color, and these are sponsored seats, intended for people that young people who maybe can't afford the fee, and this gives them, an incentive to come, and also kind of the assurance there's going to be other people of color there. And that's worked out, I thought, really well for them in the past few years. You can see that it's bringing in new people to this. It's a regional convention. It's bringing in new people. People come just for the workshop and then decide to stay for the convention, and they bring back friends and family members, and just things like that. So inviting people, encouraging people, making space for people, that's always going to be important, I think.
Yeah, I think there's something too I want to add, which is the importance of consultants and sensitivity readers. If you can bring those in, especially bringing in consultants early, because the earlier you bring in an accessibility and inclusion, the more affordable it's going to be, because you're building it in from the ground up rather than trying to retcon and rebuild to accommodate things that you didn't anticipate, which part of what a lot of this is the things you don't know that you don't know. Even though the ADA has been law for 30 years, people just aren't aware of what basic inclusion and access look like. So I think that's something that's really important. But one of the other things I wanted to touch on is, how do you start building in these things that cost money when you don't necessarily have the money as a creator, when creative endeavors so often are not financially lucrative, when it's expensive to create these things and you don't have a ton of budget, where you're not making money yourself? And how can you start making sure that you're still creating inclusive products? And also, Zezi Olson asked about, and I think this is part tied into the sensitivity reader question, when it comes to representation in your own work, how do you represent people accurately, coming from a perspective of not putting the social burden on minorities and marginalized people you're representing?
Well, I mean, I think that that for an awful lot of this, it doesn't cost money. The sensitivity readers, yes, you should be hiring somebody. Absolutely, that is something that people deserve to be paid for. But so much of this, I think Divya had a comment about self-censoring. Well, not, I think you did have a comment about self-censoring earlier, and I was reminded about this is a thing that I see a lot with conventions, where because so many conventions have this, authors or creators have to submit to be considered on panels for conventions, and so many people of color self-censor out of those things because they just assume that, I mean, they get, I've seen it, I saw it this year, we've seen it, we see it every year. This is a thing that consistently happens. And so after a little while, you just get tired of, anybody would get tired of continually putting yourself out there. So, there's a couple of local conventions that have done very, very well. And when somebody asked them, I seem to recall that their director said, "Oh, we just asked." That was all it took, because they just asked and were the ones to reach out instead of waiting for somebody to contact them. And that's all it took. People were more than enthusiastic to participate if they knew they were wanted. And I think that is a thing that, again, that's just human nature. It's nice to be asked. So a lot of these things are just matters of taking the time to think about it. Particularly in terms of what you were saying earlier about sensitivity readers, not only do you not know what you don't know, but you don't necessarily know what your microaggressions and your the things that you are not aware, the prejudices and biases that sneak into all of us you know, you maybe didn't do it intentionally. I certainly have had situations come up where somebody has pointed out to me, a sensitivity reader has pointed out to me, hey, did you realize how this comes off? And like, oh, nope, I sure didn't. Let's change that. It's very important, but it takes intention.
The
It
language
takes
we use
intention.
is so biased, and once you start digging into the linguistic ableism and linguistic racism, it's just startling and kind of a takes a lot of reevaluation.
I feel like we're
Wanted to
defining
add-
this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to add to a few things to Jen's point. You know, outside of SpecFic, I'm also an engineer and have been for far longer than I've been an author. And there, I think I was overcoming much more gender bias, right? Especially, you know, starting in the early mid 90s. I was often the only woman in the room. And even today, there's been a term coined for it, which is manels, which is at tech conferences, there tends to be predominantly men. And I had this conversation with an entrepreneur and like fund manager that I will never forget, because he was lamenting to me how hard it was to find, you know, women and BIPOC people to come serve on his conference panels, because he needed people who were like vice presidents or executives. You know, he's like, I need name people, and there just aren't enough women and people of color name people. And I was kind of staring at him and thinking, how are they going to become name people if you don't give them space to come and speak? Like, this is a vicious cycle that you are trapped in. There are perfectly competent people who are not, you know, who are maybe director level, but it's like 20, 30 years ago, they weren't allowed to be in these spaces. So today, obviously, yeah, there's very few of them. You can't expect the same ones to be coming to every single conference over and over again. I think we have a similar phenomenon in the speculative fiction community, right? Where people have a conception of what a fan looks like or what a creator looks like. And people also tend to go after the big names. And the big names are still the names that were dominating, you know, up through the 70s, maybe the 80s if you're lucky. But there are so many new creators in the past decade, especially, right, who would love to step up and participate. And so, you know, 100% to Jen's point, like, you have to just go and invite them in. And to kind of bring it back to Jennifer's original question about, you know, how do you do this if you're low on budget, right? And I would say in general for newer authors, you know, having that opportunity to come and talk to people, kind of like I am here, is pretty valuable in and of itself, right? And especially if you don't have to be the only one who's, you know, being in these spaces over and over again. And you don't. I think anyone who watched FireCon or participated could see that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of fans and creators of all kinds of races, genders, abilities, right, who are super happy to come and geek out. And we've been geeking out since we were kids. We just didn't have the community. So it's great to be part of that community today. And it doesn't have to cost you a ton. And more often, maybe not as a sensitivity reader, but if you just wanted to interview someone about their cultural experience, they're often happy to talk to you just for half an hour, you know, as any journalist will tell you, like, people love talking about themselves. So you can do the same thing if you're creating fiction and you're not sure, especially if it's, you know, minor characters, subplots. Go out there and ask people to just, you know, have a chat. Like, they don't have to be your fellow creators. They could just be, you know, your neighbors or family members or friends of family members. And that, again, doesn't cost you anything but, you know, a little bit of time and effort.
Yeah, that's one thing I find. I agree so much. And it's one thing I find really frustrating about some conventions is how the people who are doing the programming don't have a wide knowledge of the field or a current knowledge of the field. I think we see this happen, excuse me, over and over again with World Fantasy, where it seems like this is World Fantasy from 1970s, or, it's very seldom ever gets up to the 80s. And I've known people in regional conventions who were excellent programmers, and they were also excellent convention programmers, and they were also voracious readers. And they had either read or knew about almost everything that had come out that year in science fiction and fantasy. And they were able to know which authors lived nearby, who could be invited and didn't need any money for travel, who would come just for a free membership for them and their partner, and that kind of thing, and how you could get new people to talk about their new stories and things that had been, maybe getting big online, but were not terribly well known yet. And it's just so frustrating that we still have like major conventions where people aren't doing that. And they're not, it's like they're still you have people who are participating in fandom at these high levels and programming these conventions, but they're not reading, or they're only reading their few favorite authors. They're not reading anything new, and they're not even looking at new things. And I just find that the most frustrating thing in the world in fandom. It just drives me up the wall.
I also want to include just how much of a resource the internet is for this information, and how if you do a little digging, there's tons of stuff out there. It's part of why I created the toolkit, was to create a single place people could start to do that research specifically for disability, because there were some resources out there, but we needed more. But those things exist. People are writing about these issues, and it's available for free. And people are volunteering to talk with you for free. So doing the homework on your own whenever you're trying to bring those things to your world is a really fantastic way. I think the last, since we're coming up on time, I think the last question I'd love to talk about is, what opportunities do inclusion and accessibility present for storytelling? What are the things that you can do when you have these things in your stories? Why include them? What can you do that's different versus not being inclusive and accessible storytelling and creation?
I've just popped through a link if Gray or Jen or whoever has access to paste into chat wants to share it. Incredible that you asked that question now, because I actually had that copied and pasted before you said that. So we are vibing.
Ace is amazing, by the way.
Yeah. Ace is fantastic. So my beautiful, wonderful friend and just the coolest person on the whole internet, Ace Ratcliffe, wrote an article for IO9 and Gizmodo a while ago about physical design in science fiction spaces and how that reflects the ableist presence that we live in. And one of the easiest ways to kind of train your brain to start thinking beyond the world we live in when you're building fictional worlds and you want them to be accessible is to just walk around your city and deliberately seek out obstacles that you would encounter if you are a person that had a body that is different than yours. Imagine, okay, so if I'm walking around my city, what if I can't walk? What if I am blind? What if I am colorblind? What if I am fat? You have to try and imagine yourself as a person who is facing barriers different to the barriers that you yourself face. And if you spend even just 5 or 10 minutes traversing a standard urban environment, you will find dozens. You might find hundreds. Really good example, actually. So I'm very lucky in that it was a good pain day for me at the time. But I got invited to an event this week that took place in a bar. Sorry, guys, I live in New Zealand. I'm going to events in bars. You can all hate me as much as you like, but
Fine.
this bar was at the top of 8 flights of stairs, and the building had no lift. And since it's a heritage building, it's allowed to exist without a lift. But like this was an event that over a dozen people were invited to, and I stopped and I wondered, and I was like, did they consider whether or not any of us would be bringing partners who were disabled? Because they knew all of us who they'd invited, but they'd also said we could bring guests. And it's like, what if my guest that I wanted to bring was not able to attend because of this space? And that's a building that I walk past every single day to go to work. And I did not know that it was up 8 flights of stairs to actually get to the thing where the sign is. And those little things are everywhere. And one of the best, easiest steps that you can do is to just amble around your place of residence and look for stuff like that. And then sit down and write, what if it wasn't like that?
Ideally with someone who is disabled, because they'll be able to point out things that you would not notice otherwise. Because something like, the wearing a blindfold or something and trying to experience things, it can get very tricky on that front. But if you can go with someone disabled, and more than 26% of the population is, so it's not that hard to find somebody to go with.
I think there's sort of an inherent question, which is, if you're not writing an inclusive story, have you actually given your characters anything interesting to do? Right? I mean, like you've got the fact that we have diversity in our character base means that they can come from different places, they can come from different backgrounds, and they can express those things as characters. And so by nature, my job is made easier by the fact that I don't have to essentially tell the same story over and over again. I can tell different stories. And so, I don't see, our characters are deeply developed, and we get people who find the willingness to play something that isn't them a thrill, right? We also get people who, there's a famous thread about our Pathfinder game that it says, why so many female characters? So we get people who have different opinions on things, right? But the vast majority of folks that I've encountered, seem to want to experience life differently. And so if you only make the thing they know, or that experience isn't going to be there. I think it's just simply, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the easy thing to do.
Yeah, that's it exactly. It's actually the
most interesting thing to do.
Right? Yeah. I mean, if you try to, relegate things to a very specific, very tight, what fantasy has looked like for so long, what science fiction has looked like for so long, where in science fiction and fantasy both, you can have all kinds of different ethnicities as long as they're monsters.
Sure.
as long as they're
my dragons are very
not
diverse.
Human at all. It opens up the whole world. Like you have all this extra, all these things that you can do with society and with culture that you can address that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. It gives you so many more tools to work with. I can't imagine limiting myself to this narrow little band.
I'd also like to flip the question around in a way, and that is, why wouldn't you include everyone? Because that's the world we live in. And yeah, sure, we're writing, the future, or we're writing the past, but all these people are around in the future. Well, hopefully they'll be around in the future, and they have all been around in the past. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to exclude any kind of communities. I mean, disabilities are going to exist in the future. They might be different from the disabilities we're dealing with today, just like the ones we're dealing with today are different from the ones we've dealt with in the past. But that doesn't mean that they're all just magically going to disappear, right? People are still going to have problems with their bodies. Yeah, so for me, it's really kind of the opposite. It's like it feels very unnatural not to have wide representation, because it begs the question, where did all those people go? What happened to them? Why aren't they here in this world that you've created? And especially for me, so I live in Southern California, which is, very, very diverse in many ways. And it's like, thinking about a society that's extremely homogenous is just, it's not my lived experience, and it feels very unnatural. So yeah, even more than just the positives, I would say the flip side is it's going to read strangely, especially in 2020, to write something that doesn't include all the varieties of human beings and animals and every other fantastical thing you can come up with.
I want to pull on that just for 1 second, the idea about people existing in the future. And when Whoopi Goldberg took Star Trek, the reason she took it is because she said it was really important to me to show that there were Black people in the future. And I think in terms of any marginalized community, I think we all kind of feel the same way, that if we don't exist in fiction and in stories about worlds that are not this world, it goes beyond erasure into,
silent genocide.
Genocide, yeah. Because it says that we don't deserve to exist in your idealized or imagined future fantasy story world.
That's one of the really frustrating things of the people that will say, well, my fantasy is historically accurate. And it's like, hey, no, it's not. And they seem to really have this belief that people in the past all stayed where they were. Boats were invented pretty early on. Boats and walking. And
walking. Walking great distances.
But if you look,
it's not like the wheelchair was invented in China in like, I can't even remember what year. Very, 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 very,
walking
very
was
early.
invented really earlier than that too. So it's like
Yeah.
it doesn't drive, again, another thing that drives me up the wall.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how people will impart their own biases onto your lived experience as well. I have written stuff that's been set in all sorts of various places where I myself have lived, and I have written stories inspired by my own life. I have written stories sometimes that's literally just like a thing that happened to me with the serial numbers filed off, and I've had people show up in the comments like, excuse me, it's not like that. And it's like, yeah, that it wasn't like that for you, but your experience isn't everyone else's experience. And the only way that you can discover that is by talking to people who have different experiences than you. It's like when I moved to my current neighborhood that I'm in, one of my friends was like, are you going to be like bored living there? It's so white. And like, I walk around my neighborhood and it's like, have you been here? Like, do you just, and then it turns out like basically what she's imagining when she's thinking about the place where I live is she's thinking of the very, very end of the very long street where I live on, where all the like malls are. And like, yes, that's where the white moms buy their Uggs or whatever. But like, there's a whole nother not gentrified part of this entire neighborhood that is historically an immigrant neighborhood, and it's historically a very diverse place. And it's full of people who are resisting those gentrification efforts. And when you walk down this street, you see the things that you have been conditioned to see. You see the stuff that is normal for you. And the only way to break yourself out of that mindset is to deliberately seek out new and different experiences and just talk to people about their lives.
Yeah, I live near Houston.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Go ahead.
I just live near Houston, which is a very international city, a very diverse city. I think it's less than 50% white. It competes with New York as to which is the most diverse city in the country. And so, yeah, going from that to going to other places where it is really homogenous always seems really strange. It just doesn't feel right.
I think the question that Casey puts in my head is, if you're not willing to um, diversify your experience, why would you be in the business of trying to show anybody else what you think? Like if you're in the business of creating new worlds, right, you should probably be more capable of absorbing new experiences than than shying away from them. And I know that it's challenging sometimes, but I think you'll like your fan base better if what you create is more diverse, because the opposite is also true. If you create things that only appeal to a small group of people, it will be both smaller and less likable. Whereas if you create something that appeals to a broad group of people, you'll have a diverse experience with your own fan base, and that fan base probably will be larger. And so it's almost like there's no economic or story based or experience based reason to shut yourself off. And so it still pains me to see, though, that a huge number of people in my community do exactly that, because they can't imagine working in teams with women, or they can't imagine working in teams with people who are not like them, or whatever. I understand why they're like that. I understand the lure of the familiar, but it doesn't produce the best results.
No. I write second world fantasy, and I all the time have people come back to me and they'll say, this word you used is not is anachronistic. And I'll always have to come back with, it's not Earth history. Nobody's speaking English. There isn't anything, this isn't, you're trying to staple this idea, this perception that you have of what fantasy should look like onto this story. And the funny thing is that I've never had anybody come back to me with the same word. It's always a different word that strikes somebody as being wrong. Our biases are so individual and so unique, and then sometimes not unique at all.
Yeah, it's frustrating when you get, or someone's gotten a comment from someone who is like that, who is very unable to see that their biases are their biases and not actually something in reality. And people want to take that into account. So, well, this person didn't like it. And it's like, well, let's forget that person. Just, go away. We don't need them. And it's just like, it's just part of that. I guess it's that, I don't know, fear to be different or something, and it's always like, see, people, it just seems like people are always listening to the smallest common denominator, who is not particularly representative of the other people who are the audience for the thing you're creating.
I'll also add that sometimes people mean well, in the sense that they're not coming in with bigotry, but with unconscious bias. I have an example from my novella Runtime, where the main character is a poor immigrant person of color, and she happens to be very clever and techie and can hack and engineer and do all this stuff. But she hasn't been hugely successful. And I had someone comment to me that didn't seem very realistic to him, that, if she were really that talented, like, someone would have figured it out, and, she'd be doing much better for herself in life. And I kind of had to just step back for a second and be like, wow, I know so many people for whom that's not true. But
it's that easy, is it, Guy?
Yeah, it's like, maybe it's that easy for you because of the way you look, and your particular demographics make it easier for you to see people succeed, right? To come up from being poor. But there are other people for whom no amount of talent is sufficient, until someone opens that door, right? So it's that kind of thing where, he didn't come at me as like, oh, like this is, this is totally unrealistic and stupid, but it was more kind of like, in my experience, like this would always magically resolve itself. And it's like, well, in my experience, not so much.
Oh.
I want to we're going to go a little bit longer because this is an awesome conversation and we have some good questions coming in from chat. Micronix asks, how do you balance telling your main character's stories and the stories of those around them?
Well, that's really dependent on your story. I'm a big point of view person. I like to stick to either one point of view or just a couple other point of views. It just kind of, it's just story dependent. You don't want to, it's like the number of characters you include is kind of going to be limited by your plot and what's going on. That's a really complicated question in a lot of ways, because if your story is focused on telling these people's stories, that's going to be different than if your plot is focused on what's happening with your main character. And there's ways for your main character to observe what's going on with the other characters and for them to tell their stories. But it's kind of really going to be, I really believe everything should be in service to the story. So it kind of depends on what you're doing with your story is how you want to do that. It's really complicated. We could do an entire writing workshop.
Yeah.
We totally could. Yeah.
I write 100 new characters a year, so I don't know how to really answer that question.
I wonder if it's coming from are they asking from a perspective of inclusivity in that sense of like, how do you, give fair representation to a variety of characters? And if so, I would only say that, your main character, like Martha says, has got to be is your focus, right? This is your point of view character. You're living in that person's head. But your side characters, I would say, try to make them well-rounded. You don't necessarily have to tell their entire backstory or give everyone an arc. You just have to make sure they're not caricatures, they're not stereotypes. So in fact, I would say try to break the stereotype. If you see yourself falling into, okay, I'm gonna put a disabled person, don't make them, just like the inspirational disabled person, right? Like look for those tropes that are already out there and then do your best to be conscious of them and try to make the character more interesting.
And it is tricky because I'm in the Murderbot Diaries and the fantasy I've written, I've a lot of times tried to show that the characters are actually not in a homogenous society. They're encountering a bunch of different cultures who have a bunch of different expressions of gender and who are a bunch of different races, and they do things differently. And it's hard to do that without just bogging down in description, especially when you're doing secondary world fantasy or far future, where the terms we use for things would be irrelevant in this situation. So yeah, it is tricky. It's just, it just takes hard work and thinking a lot about it.
I just thought of an answer.
I think this is,
go ahead, sorry.
I think this is also a matter of, again, if you have more than one representation, if you have a lot of diversity, then you get cut some slack, I think.
Sure.
If it is very obvious that you have a very diverse world, then the onus to make each individual example of diversity a shining star that has their own individual arc kind of goes away.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with this, was that it's important not just to have characters from diverse backgrounds who then explain how their background is diverse. Like some of these characters, and I would actually kind of hope the majority, just need to do the same things your other characters might do, right? I mean, there's no, like, our lead paladin is an African. Well, I guess she's not African American because she's not from America, but she's a Black female, and I don't think we go out of our way to say anything about that lived experience with her. That doesn't mean it's not affected by her past, and her past wouldn't be different. Her childhood past, in fact, is very different because of that background. But her, on a daily basis, she's not a representation. She's a character, right? Her job is to do what her job in the story is to do. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be some characters that do introduce you to new ways of looking at things, right? That's also critically important. But it doesn't have to bog down. Like we talk about this like it sounds like a weight. And it really isn't. Like, they're just characters. They need to function in the environment like human beings, or if they're not human beings, something else.
I think it's worth noting too that people can be more than one thing. Like I know that people have had issues with writing a disabled queer person of color, and people go, no one exists like that. No one is multiply marginalized. And everyone's going, but I am. Hello, I exist. So I don't think you have to be afraid for people to be human beings with more than one lived marginalization, or more than one lived experience in a variety of different ways.
I realize one thing that just occurred to me on the basis of this. All my characters have pictures, like literally every single one of them. But I guess that's not true for some of you.
Right.
Like, there's no point where there has to be a point where you, if you want to say they're from a different background, you have to say it. And I don't have to do that, because the first thing you're going to see,
all books were illustrated,
right? First thing you're going to see when you pick a character in my game or my story is their picture, right?
Yeah.
How does that work?
It's tough. You have to find it. Well, there's the classic thing of the person looks into the mirror and describes themselves, as we all do every day, every time we brush our teeth.
That sounds horrible.
So having to, that's like a really, one of the things you kind of have to get through really quickly is kind of learning how to describe your viewpoint character without sounding like there's something, this person is a narcissist or something.
I have a really good link that I'm going to include about describing people, because there are terms that you really want to avoid. That is often a sign of unconscious bias. I'm going to grab that and I'll give it to Gray to throw in the chat.
Sure. But do you do it like first? Do you do it second, fifth, 12th? Like,
there's no right answer.
Yeah, there's no right answer.
It's different every time.
Go. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's definitely, it's going to depend on your story, your background, your setting. Is this normal? Is this remarkable?
Yeah.
That all changes depending on how your point of view, your narration perceives this difference.
And I really think that's why so many stories start with someone the main character going into a strange place, because that gives you an excuse to describe all these new things they're seeing, as opposed to you're describing things you see every day, which is not, again, we can work on that. You can make that happen, but it's more tricky.
Yeah.
It was easier when we could all write third person omniscient, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. My very first games job actually was on a MUD, and one of the facets of MUD character generation is you're occupying a character in this world that's entirely text, but you're walking around and interacting with stuff, and everything you can interact with and every person you can interact with has a description that you can use the look command to look at. And it was really fascinating to me to see the way that different people would write their character descriptions, because it really tells you sort of like what they consider to be the important features to describe about a person. And this was a MUD that had like equipment lists and inventories for like clothes and stuff. So you really were just describing the person, but you were having to describe the person as they would look wearing a normal, decent amount of clothing. So you weren't getting into like whole body detailed because that would be exhausting. But it was really fascinating how some people would just do kind of like a laundry list of like facial parts, like her eyebrows look like this. She has a nose that's a little pointy. She has a chin that's got a little scar on it. And it was just sort of like starting at the top of the face and working its way down, which was a little odd. And it was just sort of like very itemized. But like other people would write these beautiful paragraphs just describing the way their characters looked. And as an author, you almost never get to do that. So getting to see people do that in an environment where they could just, just go hard and write everything they wanted to write to describe how this person like looks and how they move and like whether or not they look tired or whether or not they look old. And it was so fascinating to see what people would prioritize when unfettered like that. And I would say that if you're wanting a good way to learn to describe people that are different than you, or learn to describe people who are the same as you if you don't have much experience doing that either, is to just think about what your character looks like and just write a paragraph. It doesn't have to be anywhere in your story, but like just try to write just a concise little 8 to 10 sentence paragraph about like, what does this person look like when you just glance at them?
And it
I
can
do that. I call it an art description.
Yeah.
I was going to say a couple of things coming out of this are, please, if you have images, make sure that you're including text descriptions and alt text when you're putting things on social media and such. And also a really amazing resource is to listen to audio description on Netflix, which is what is used for blind low vision folks. You can turn it on as an audio option and walk away from your TV or close your eyes and give it a listen. And there's some really beautiful descriptors in there as well. I want to come off of this idea into a question that Amar Dariel asked, which is, are fantasy stereotypes okay? For example, the frail, fragile wizard, assuming, of course, they're not the only type, but one example of.
Stereotypes are not good, because for one thing, they're limiting your thinking and they're limiting your audience's thinking. So it might be more useful to look at the stereotype and see what else you can do with that. I think maybe sometimes the word archetype I'm wondering if what they're actually thinking about is fantasy archetypes rather than stereotypes.
I don't know how I would get by without archetypes.
Yeah, archetypes, can be very useful. Again, it's like it depends on what you're doing and how you want to work with them, work around them, what you want to do with them. But yeah, stereotypes and archetypes, very different. Stereotypes are more about marginalizing people, as opposed to archetypes, which is just about
Tropes.
Tropes.
It's a trope.
Yeah.
But even with archetypes, I feel like it's more fun to break them. I don't know. It's in my bio. I like to break stereotypes and defy expectations. So I like to do that even for my readers. Like, I think it's a lot more fun to take an archetype or a stereotype, but preferably the archetype, right? The classic, whatever character, and then find a way to turn that around, and it makes them so much more interesting and surprising.
I would say whatever you do, just do it with intention.
Mm-hmm.
Do it. Question your assumptions about what something should be. And if you decide that you want to do, a weak or sickly wizard, do it because you meant to, not because you thought that had to be that way.
I had a literary professor that thought all fantasy all fantasy characters were archetypes, period, end of sentence. And so it was really fun to go like, what is this archetype then? And it doesn't work like that.
Okay, so I thank you all so much for staying on longer. I think we'll wrap up now. I'm gonna have everyone go around and let people know where they can find you if they'd like to keep up with your work. And also, one thing that you'd really like people to think about, a takeaway, a piece of work that you'd like to refer them to, something to expand their their knowledge and information on the subject as we wrap this up.
Okay, I'll go.
We're all
I know I'm looking at
really
the.
hard
I know I'm looking
on our
at the
final
screen.
wisdom. Like
I'm looking at the screen and assuming we're going to go in Zoom chat order.
Oh, I'm so
Like,
sorry. I
that's-
didn't specify. Yeah, whoever wants to go is welcome to.
Okay, so you can find me on Twitter at Jen Lyons Author, or Instagram at Jen Lyons and Tigers, and also I have a website at jenlyons.com. And you know, if there's a oh, and please read my books. But if there's a takeaway that I would like people to have on this, it's that I think that people need to take the time to question why something has to be the way it is, and maybe see if there's a different approach that can be taken.
I'm Mike Selinker in pretty much every social media expression that can have. So you can find me on that. You can also find my company, Lone Shark Games, at that address as well. If you're not familiar with what we do, we make games and books and puzzles and all sorts of stuff. You can go take a look. If you want to read my political stuff, which often touches on issues like this, you can go to my Medium column and see that. And yeah, I mean, I always try to encourage people to not think about this stuff after they've come up with their idea, but also when they're coming up with whatever they're about to write. I mean, just start somewhere that is interesting, and there's a really good chance that your characters and your story and the rest of it will be interesting. If you start somewhere bland, you'll probably struggle to make sure that the rest of it isn't bland too. So just start in a good spot.
I'm Martha Wells. You can find me on Twitter at Martha Wells 1, because my other name was just taken. And you can find me on Dreamwith at marthawells.dreamwith.org. I think that's where I have my journal. I also have a website, marthawells.com. One thing I'd say is especially to try to read outside your comfort zone. Try new authors. You know, authors have just started writing, authors that are new to you, and maybe even take a look at some things that you don't know if you'll like a lot. The library is really good for that. Short fiction is really good for that, for finding new people and seeing if you like their work. Reading outside your comfort zone is how I've found some of my absolutely favorite books and stories. So, and it just helps to keep your mind expanding, especially as you get older. You don't want to let yourself get kind of hidebound and kind of stuck in the same rut. It's going to be better for you to just kind of keep pushing your limits out.
I guess I'll go next. So you can find my fiction and bio, etc. at sbdivya.com on my website. You can also find me on Twitter as @Divya'sTweets. And I encourage you to check out Escape Pod if you like short science fiction, either in audio or text, at escapepod.org. I will say that I have my first novel coming out in March, and it is an AI story, near future, and fairly diverse. The main characters are Latina American and a woman in South India. So check out a little bit about it at machinehood.com or at my website. And then in terms of broadening horizons, there was a great series a few years ago. People of X, I will say, destroy science fiction and fantasy and eventually horror. So people of color, people with disabilities. Check those out for a way to broaden your horizons. Nisi Shaw's anthology, New Suns, original, I'm reading it over here, original speculative fiction by people of color. You can find a lot of lists online of recommended authors of various marginalizations, books about these subjects written by people with those lived experiences. So definitely, definitely look out for all that. And finally, if you just want to watch something and have fun, Kipo and the Wonder Beasts on Netflix, which is billed as a kids show, is just like fantastic. But Netflix has this whole series right now tagged with Representation Matters, and I think it's mainly animated series or movies for kids, but it's super enjoyable even as an adult, and it's really wonderful to see what they're doing in terms of representation and inclusivity.
Yeah, I will second that recommendation. Those are fantastic. And like, even if you don't think you'll like it because it's animated, just give like one episode a go. Not all animation is for kids, and not all animation for adults needs to be like a grimdark slog. So it's very joyful and colorful, and yeah, wholeheartedly seconding that. But yeah, you can find me online as at Casey Lucas Quaid on most platforms. I only really use Twitter. I've scaled back my social media presence since I became a professional community manager, because why do that all day at work and then go home and do it all day at home? I trying to think of some stuff that I have online. My pinned tweet currently has a link to my award-winning short story, which you are welcome to read in Sponge Magazine. And I am at some stage going to be a debut novelist, as my novel is going out on submission earlier this year. So you may or may not hear about my book, The Crawling Wood, at some point in the near future. And you can also check out Monsters Out of the Closet, our podcast, which is a horror podcast that is all written, edited, and voice acted by people of various queer identities. And it explores a lot of other disabled content, content by Indigenous people, Black people, people of color. And it's also just really fun. So please check that out. And then my one bit of, wisdom, I suppose, is as you try to broaden your horizons and reach out to new people and write about stuff you are unfamiliar with, you will probably make mistakes. If people call you out on those mistakes, rather than feeling like you immediately have to defend yourself because you had good intentions, take a moment and sit with the feedback they have given you and ask yourself, from their point of view, why are they telling you this? What have you done that has caused them to reply to you in this way? Because it's probably not just because they're mean and they hate you. They probably have a really good reason for why they mentioned that to you. And you should just consider it for a moment. And I know it's really hard to rein in those emotions when they are fresh and raw, and especially if the person that you are talking to is a complete stranger on the internet, and you could just like tell them to piss off because it's the internet. But just think for a moment about the feelings there and whatever you did, the feeling that it evoked in this other person. If you wrote about something insensitively, if you made a comment that could have been misconstrued, because like at the end of the day, all you have to say is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that and I won't do it again. And it's astounding how many people don't understand how easy it is to say that. That's all it is. You just have to say, I didn't mean it that way. My bad, it won't happen again. And then you just remember it and don't do it again, because apologies aren't worth anything if you don't back it up with actually learning the lesson behind the apology.
And I am Jen Kretschmer. You can find me on Twitter as @DreamWisp, DreamWist, on Twitch as DreamWistJen. On Tuesdays, I am on D&D Beyond Silver and Steel, which is on the D&D Beyond channel. I would recommend, I always recommend Stella Young's TED Talk, which is called I Am Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much. It will make you rethink how you approach disability and inspiration porn, which is how disability is so often framed in our society. I also highly recommend Alice Wong's book, Disability Visibility, which is a collection of, there's a first-person stories from the 21st century. It's a collection of narratives that have been, by amazing disabled authors. So highly recommend that as well. This has been a spectacular conversation. Thank you all so much. Oh, also, sorry, my accessibility resource guide is in my pinned tweet. It has resources for gaming, events, streaming, publishing. It's all in there. If you need any of those resources, it's a free guide with, I think it's over 100 different resources. But thank you all so much for participating in this incredible conversation. It's such an important discussion. Please, if you're hanging out, we are here for Worldbuilders to support this phenomenal cause. These conversations have been happening all week. They will continue to be happening over the next week. There's lots of amazing gaming happening this weekend and today. And thank you all for being here, for chatting with us. Thank you so much, panelists, for everything, and to Grave and to Pat for having us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day and a fantastic weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye.